The wind, carrying the heavy salt of Tybee Island, whipped across the pavement. I stood alone exactly halfway between the two houses. The structure on my left held my furniture and my 4-year-old son. The structure on my right sat dark. A wooden sign staked into the front lawn advertised the property for sale. My thumb rubbed the base of my left ring finger. The skin there was bare. There was nothing left to twist. My chest held nothing but a deep, hollow exhaustion. I was 28 years old. I taught 2nd grade. My name was Jenna, and I had finally stopped apologizing. 8 weeks earlier, I occupied this exact same spot, but every single thing in my line of sight belonged to my husband. Mosquitoes battered themselves against the yellow glass of the porch light. The heavy air carried the sharp chemical sting of fresh exterior paint drifting over from the new build across the street. Through the open living room window, a cartoon dog chattered brightly on the television. My hands were submerged in lukewarm dishwater. Suds coated my wrists. Brandon never touched the sink. The door from the garage opened. Heavy footsteps crossed the threshold. The familiar metallic clinking of keys spinning on a finger preceded him into the kitchen. I kept my hands in the water and scrubbed a ceramic plate with a sponge. The spinning stopped. The keys hit the counter with a loud smack. I glanced over my shoulder. His leather keychain sat next to the mail. A shiny brass key rested against the dark leather. A small paper hardware store tag still dangled from the bow. I need you to really listen. He pulled out a chair. He did not wait for me to dry my hands. I left the sponge in the sink and sat across from him. He wore his crisp Oxford shirt with the sleeves rolled up precisely to the elbows. His hands rested flat on the table. "Cassidy is back in town," he said. His voice carried the same measured, even tone he used to explain interest rates to first-time homebuyers. "She is pregnant. 6 months." The refrigerator kicked on with a low hum. My wet hands rested in my lap. Water dripped from my fingertips onto my denim jeans. "I bought the new house across the street," he continued, "because I need to be close to my child. You bought a house." My voice sounded incredibly far away. "She needs help getting settled in." He leaned forward. His teeth flashed in a reassuring smile. His eyes stayed fixed. "You are going to help her. Bring dinner over a few times a week. Help set up the nursery." "You expect me to bring her dinner? She is carrying my child, Jenna. My child. And she is alone over there. I am not doing that. I want you to be an adult about this." He picked up the keychain. His thumb rubbed the shiny brass key. He tossed it in the air and caught it. "Or you can leave." "But Mason stays." The metal clicked against the granite counter. He stared right at me. "Your choice." My hand slipped back underwater in the sink. The suds were gone. The water had turned cold. I picked up the ceramic plate again. The hard, perfectly round edge grounded me. Brandon kept talking about logistics, about moving trucks and neighborhood associations, but the words separated entirely from their meaning. Granny May used to sit on the porch swing and tell me that whenever a man gives you 2 choices, you sit still until you find the third one. I could not see a third option. Not yet. I just held the plate. I gripped it so tight my knuckles turned white under the water, holding on to the only solid thing in a room that was disintegrating around me. Brandon pushed his chair back and stood up. His leather shoes tapped down the hallway. The heavy garage door vibrated the floorboards a moment later as it rumbled shut. I stood at the sink and stared out the window. A single lamp clicked on in the living room across the street. A silhouette moved slowly behind the sheer white curtains. Fabric softener and warm cotton scented the air in the bedroom. The small turtle shell on the nightstand projected green and blue stars across the ceiling. I pulled the quilt up to my son's chin. Mason tucked his stuffed dog under his arm. His small chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm. "Mommy who lives in the new house?" he asked. His voice was thick with sleep. I smoothed his hair back from his forehead. "A friend of Daddy. Why did Daddy give her keys?" My hand paused on his hair. "Children observe everything. They catch every dropped word, every shifted glance. We share things with people who need them, I managed to say. My throat felt tight. Read me the caterpillar book. Which one, baby? The one Granny May used to read. I stood up and walked to the bookshelf. I had placed a brightly colored alphabet sticker on every single shelf to help him learn his letters. My gaze drifted up past the board books, past the framed photo of Mason as a newborn, all the way to the very top. A small rectangular tin box sat pushed back against the wall. Embossed dogwood flowers decorated the lid. The metal caught the faint green light from the plastic turtle and threw a dull reflection against the paint. Granny May pressed that box into my hands on my wedding day. She told me to keep it safe. I placed it on the top shelf 6 years ago. Just old papers, forms, tax things I did not understand, because Brandon always handled the mail. I looked at the dogwood flowers. I turned my back to the shelf. I pulled the thick cardboard caterpillar book from the bottom row and sat back on the edge of the mattress. I turned the rigid pages. Granny May's raspy, warm voice echoed in my head with every sentence I read aloud. She always tapped the page twice when the hungry green bug ate the strawberry. I tapped the page twice. Mason smiled and closed his eyes. The Wednesday morning sun baked the heavy dew off the grass. I walked out the back door and stepped into the garden. A small rectangular patch of dirt sat near the wooden fence. Weeds choked the soil. Spiky green stems shot up through the cracked, dry earth. I crouched down. I wrapped my fingers around a thick clump of crabgrass. I pulled. The roots ripped out of the ground with a soft, tearing sound. Mason jogged across the lawn, dragging a yellow plastic dump truck behind him. The plastic wheels rattled over the uneven ground. "Mommy planting tomatoes?" he asked. He dropped the truck and squatted next to me. "Your great-grandmother planted tomatoes right here," I told him. I shook the loose dirt from the roots in my hand. Why did we stop? We just forgot. I stood up and wiped my dirty hands on my jeans. I looked over the low wooden fence. The new house loomed large and bright white against the morning sky. Cassidy stood on the back porch. She wore a loose, white robe. A glass of orange juice rested in her right hand. Her left hand cupped the underside of her swollen stomach. She looked across the property line. Her eyes met mine. She smiled. It was a slow, sweet, completely unbothered smile. She owned the space. She took a sip of her juice. I dropped my gaze back to the dirt. My chest tightened. 3 paths stretched out in my mind. I could comply. I could cook the casseroles, walk across the street, smile at the woman carrying my husband's child, and swallow the humiliation whole just to keep the peace. I could pack a bag and leave. But where would I go? I had $840 in a separate checking account. My part-time teaching schedule brought in exactly $1,600 a month. Brandon managed the credit cards, the mortgage, and me. I had no lawyer and no leverage. If I left, he would keep Mason in the only house my son had ever known. The third path meant fighting back. But you cannot fight a war with empty hands. I did not know how much money sat in our joint savings. I did not even know whose name sat on the deed to the house. The heavy scent of fast food French fries filled the enclosed space of the car. Crumb fragments dotted the upholstery of the back seat. The Savannah afternoon sun beat brutally through the windshield. The black steering wheel burned against my palms. I sat in the preschool parking lot with the engine off. My phone vibrated in the cup holder. Gloria's name flashed across the screen. My thumb found the edge of my wedding ring. I pushed it up to the knuckle and slid it back down. The metal was hot from the sun. I picked up the phone and pressed it to my ear. "Hello, Jenna. He came over last night." Gloria rarely bothered with greetings. Her voice clipped the ends of her words, practical and sharp. He did. He sat right at my kitchen table and announced he is expanding his family. A sharp exhale hissed through the speaker, like he was opening a second real estate office. "He told you about Cassidy." he told me. Then he asked if I would babysit Mason on Fridays so he could spend quality time over there. I said absolutely not. He said I was being dramatic. My thumb kept spinning the ring. Gloria, I have no idea what to do. Listen to me very carefully. Richard did the exact same thing to me. Same charming smile, same perfectly reasonable explanations, same accusations about overreacting. I was 29 years old. I let him dictate the terms. I watched him walk out that door, and I waited 30 years for him to walk back. He died on Route 16 with that woman in the passenger seat. A horn honked in the distance. The heat inside the car pressed down on my chest, making it hard to draw a full breath. Gloria's voice carried the flat, steady cadence of someone reciting a fact she had accepted long ago. But underneath the steadiness, a hairline fracture ran through every word. She was not telling me her story to earn sympathy. She was telling me her story so I would not live it twice. 30 years. 3 decades of waiting for a man who chose someone else every single day he was alive. The math was brutal and simple. If I walked back into that house and complied, I would lose the same 30 years. The only difference was that I still had time to choose differently. Did you ever open that tin box May gave you? Gloria asked. My thumb stopped moving. The box on the shelf. It is just some old papers. Tax documents. May sat in my living room 2 weeks before she passed away. She looked right at me and said, if Jenna ever needs a place to stand, tell her to open the box. A place to stand. I brushed it off at the time. Now I am certain she saw this coming. Saw what coming? That Brandon is Richard's son through and through. Mommy, are we going home? Mason asked from the back seat. He kicked the back of my chair with his sneaker. Open the box, Jenna. Tonight. The line clicked dead. I dropped the phone back into the cup holder. I turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life. Cold air blasted from the dashboard, vents hitting my flushed face. I pulled out of the parking lot and approached the main intersection. The left turn lane led back to the house, to the spinning keys, to the new build across the street. I engaged the right turn signal. I checked the mirror. I steered the car away from my husband and drove straight toward Gloria's townhouse. The drive to Gloria's townhouse took exactly 20 minutes, but it felt like I was crossing a vast, unfamiliar ocean. I parked my car in her narrow driveway and walked Mason to her front door. Faded floral wallpaper from the 1990s clung to the walls of her small kitchen. Mason immediately settled on the living room rug, captivated by a colorful game on my tablet. Gloria motioned for me to sit at her round wooden table. She set a sweating glass of iced sweet tea in front of me. I looked at the refrigerator beside us. It was covered in school photographs and crayon drawings made by Mason. There was not a single photograph of Brandon past the age of 12. She had stopped framing his face the year Richard left, the year her son started wearing his father's exact same smile. Gloria sat across from me and folded her thin hands over the wood. She did not offer me platitudes. She offered me the brutal truth of her own history. Richard sat right where you are sitting, she said, her voice dropping lower so Mason would not hear. He wore a crisp suit, and he looked at me with total confidence. He told me he was expanding his family. He told me I needed to be a mature adult about the situation. I traced the condensation dripping down the side of my glass. And what did you do? I did exactly what he wanted. I stayed quiet. I thought if I made myself small enough, if I accommodated his mess, he would eventually realize his mistake and come back to me. She leaned forward and her eyes were as hard as river stones. I lost my husband, and then I lost 30 years of my life, waiting for an apology that never came. He built a whole new life while I just faded into the background. I looked at her gray hair. I looked at the deep lines around her mouth. She was 62 years old, and she had survived a fire that I was only just stepping into. If I walked back into my house and cooked a meal for Cassidy, I would become a ghost in my own life. I imagined myself 3 decades from now, sitting at a kitchen table, explaining to Mason how I let a man break me down to nothing. The image made me physically sick. A sudden, sharp clarity pierced through the fog of my shock. I would not comply. I would not serve them. I need a lawyer, I whispered. Gloria slid a small white business card across the table. A woman from my church used her last year. She offers a free consultation. Gloria tapped the card twice. You need to find out exactly where Brandon got the money to buy that new house. And Jenna, when you go home tonight, you open that tin box May gave you. You read every single piece of paper inside it. The house was silent by midnight. Mason was fast asleep in his bed. The plastic turtle shell cast its familiar green and blue stars across his ceiling. I reached up to the top shelf and pulled down the small metal box embossed with dogwood flowers. I sat on the floor, leaning my back against the edge of the mattress, and pulled off the lid. A piece of lined notebook paper rested on top of a thick stack of stapled legal documents. The handwriting was unmistakably my grandmother's, written in faded blue ballpoint pen. Jenna honey, the letter began. I left this land to you. Both lots. This trust means nobody can take it from you unless you agree to it. Do not sign anything without your own lawyer. Love, May. I set the letter aside and lifted the heavy packet of paper. The cover page read May Calloway Living Trust in bold black letters. I flipped past pages of dense legal terminology until my eyes caught my own name. The document named Jenna Marie Calloway as the successor, trustee, and sole beneficiary. Directly beneath my name was the property description. Lot 14A and Lot 14B, Victory Drive, Chatham County. My heart slammed heavily against my ribs. The air in the room thinned. The property lines of our street were burned into my memory from 6 years of walking Mason to the playground and back. Lot 14A was the dirt sitting directly beneath my current house and garden. Lot 14B was the empty lot right next door. It was the exact same piece of land where Cassidy's brand new white house currently stood. I stared at the paper until the letters blurred. I did not notice the small, tightly folded second piece of lined paper wedged between page 4 and page 5. I just kept staring at the property description. I owned the ground under her house. The following Thursday afternoon, I sat in my parked car outside the grocery store and spoke to Rhonda Price over the phone. Her voice carried a clipped professional cadence that left no room for emotion. Mrs. Hargrove, I have reviewed the trust document, Rhonda said. Are you aware that Lot 14B was sold to a residential developer 18 months ago? I had no idea, I replied, gripping the steering wheel. Who authorized the sale? I do not know. According to this trust, only you possess the legal authority to authorize a sale of that specific parcel, she explained smoothly. If someone else facilitated that transaction without your signature, that deed is entirely void. 2 weeks later, I sat alone at my kitchen table. The house was quiet except for the steady, rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. I took a sip of warm coffee. The heavy, oppressive air of Brandon's constant presence was finally gone. I had filed for a fault-based divorce, officially citing adultery. The judge had swiftly granted my requests for temporary orders. I kept the house in primary physical custody of Mason while we waited for the final settlement hearing. Brandon was ordered to pay $2,200 a month in temporary spousal support. The judge ordered him to vacate the marital home immediately. With nowhere else to go, Brandon packed 2 large suitcases and walked across the street, moving directly into the house he had purchased for his pregnant mistress. The irony tasted like ash in my mouth. A stack of legal paperwork covered the wood in front of me. Rhonda had just called with the results of the title search. The puzzle pieces had violently snapped together. When my grandmother passed away, she had never officially recorded the trust assignment at the county deed office. The county record still showed May owning the lots personally. The court-appointed estate administrator simply looked at the county records and included Lot 14B in the probate estate, unaware that the trust even existed. But someone had to point the developer toward that specific empty lot. Someone had to assure the administrator that the land was clear to sell. Brandon Hargrove. He was a highly connected real estate agent. He knew the land was sitting there. He knew I had never bothered to open the tin box. He facilitated the entire sale, matching the developer with the administrator, and he hid the entire transaction from me while I was busy raising his son. He collected a commission check for $15,800 on the sale. The developer bought the lot for $158,000 and built a $265,000 house on it. Brandon then used our joint savings to buy that very same house for Cassidy. He drained $48,000 for the down payment and $6,200 for closing costs. It was a massive, calculated dissipation of marital funds. And because I had filed on the grounds of adultery, Georgia law barred him from claiming any alimony from me. I had the trust document. I had the paper trail of his secret commission. I had the bank statements proving the dissipation. I had him entirely cornered. I pushed the papers aside, stood up, and walked over to the kitchen window. I looked across the street, expecting to feel a surge of absolute triumph. Cassidy was standing on her front porch. She rested one hand on the wooden railing and the other on her pregnant stomach. She looked straight across the street at my house. She did not look like a woman whose life was built on a voided title. She did not look scared or worried or apologetic. She just smiled. It was the calm, patient smile of someone who knew a secret I had not figured out yet. A cold, heavy knot of unease tightened in the pit of my stomach. The victory suddenly felt fragile, like thin ice cracking under my boots. My cell phone rang loudly on the granite counter. Brandon's name lit up the screen. I stood perfectly still and watched it ring until it went to voicemail. A minute later, a notification chimed. I pressed play on the audio message. "Babe, we need to talk." Brandon's voice filled the quiet kitchen. He did not sound angry. He sounded incredibly calm, adopting the same slow, condescending tone he used on our 4-year-old son. "My lawyer says you filed some kind of property claim. You are making a mistake. A really big mistake. I am going to fix this, Jenna. You do not want to make this ugly." The message ended. The silence returned to the kitchen, but it no longer felt safe. 4 days later, a thick manila envelope landed heavily on my front porch. I carried it into the kitchen and ripped the reinforced flap open. I sat at the wooden table and spread the crisp white pages across the surface. The legal header bore the name of a highly aggressive attorney from downtown Savannah, a man whose reputation was built entirely on bleeding the opposing party dry until they surrendered. Brandon had clearly tapped into his real estate commissions and borrowed from his colleagues to afford that letterhead. My hands began to shake as I read the first page. He filed a formal claim of parental alienation. The black ink stated plainly that I was actively poisoning Mason against his father. Brandon alleged I was refusing to allow father and child bonding time and creating a hostile environment out of pure spite. I swallowed hard and turned to the second page. It was a motion to dismiss my property claim entirely. His new attorney argued the trust document appeared fraudulently altered. He formally demanded a forensic document examination. He also invoked a legal defense, claiming I had waited far too long to assert my ownership over the dirt across the street. The third page knocked the breath clean out of my lungs. It was an emergency custody modification. Brandon formally requested an immediate 50-50 physical custody split. He argued that my erratic behavior regarding the property proved I was an unstable mother. He was building a narrative where I was unhinged, my chest clamped shut. The walls of the kitchen seemed to lean inward. A cold spiral of panic started in my stomach and shot straight up to my throat. I did not have the money to hire a forensic document expert. I barely had enough to cover the grocery bill. If the judge looked at his expensive lawyer and looked at my part-time teaching salary, they might actually believe him. They might take Mason away from me. They might say the trust was a fake and I would lose absolutely everything. My cell phone buzzed violently against the wood, making me jump. Rhonda Price spoke in her usual flat, serious tone the second I answered. "You received the filings?" she asked. "He says I am unstable. He says I am keeping his son from him." "These are classic delay tactics, Mrs. Hargrove," Rhonda said. He wants to scare you into dropping the property claim by threatening your custody. But the custody motion itself is very real. We cannot ignore it. We need to prepare for an emergency hearing. The following week, the second-floor hallway of the county courthouse smelled sharply of lemon floor cleaner and old decaying paper. The hard terrazzo floor amplified the sound of every clicking heel passing by. I sat on a rigid wooden bench outside the heavy double doors of the courtroom. Gloria had stayed back at my house to watch Mason. I wore a navy blue blazer I had borrowed from her closet. The fabric sat a little too wide on my shoulders and smelled faintly of her lavender soap. My damp palms gripped a plain manila folder containing my copies of the trust documents. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a low, irritating frequency that drilled straight into my temples. The emergency hearing lasted exactly 45 minutes. The judge did not rule on the custody change right then and there. Instead, he ordered a guardian ad litem evaluation. A complete stranger, appointed by the court, would come to my house, interview me, interview Brandon, and sit down alone with my 4-year-old son to determine who was the fit parent. The judge also granted Brandon his request for a forensic examination of the tin box document. Everything was frozen. The property case ground to an absolute halt while we waited 2 to 3 weeks for the expedited lab results. I walked out of the courtroom with my shoulder bag, feeling heavier than lead. Brandon stood by the hallway drinking fountain. He wore a perfectly tailored gray suit. A female court clerk walked past us, carrying a tall stack of files. Brandon immediately softened his posture. He adopted a gentle, incredibly concerned expression for his audience. "See," Brandon said, keeping his voice low and soothing. "I told you, babe. You are making this much harder than it needs to be." I stopped walking. I gripped the strap of my bag. "Do not call me that. The evaluator is going to see a stable father and a mother who is clearly going through something terrible." He sighed deeply, placing a hand over his chest. He made sure the clerk glancing back over her shoulder could see his posture. "I am worried about you, Jenna. I really am. You need help." I did not give him a reaction. I turned away and walked fast down the long corridor. I rode the elevator down to the parking garage and climbed into my car. I locked the doors. The engine stayed off. My hands gripped the top of the steering wheel. Brandon was winning. He possessed the money to hire a ruthless lawyer. He held a prominent position in the church and the community. He commanded the exact kind of charm required to convince a judge that my legitimate property claim was simply the delusion of a bitter, unstable woman. And I held nothing but a tin box and a piece of paper the court currently refused to acknowledge. Every step I took forward resulted in 2 massive steps backward. My phone rang in the cup holder. Gloria's name lit the screen. I stared at the green button. I pressed it and lifted the phone to my ear. "How did it go?" she asked. My throat closed up. I pressed my forehead against the hot steering wheel. I could not form a single word. I sat in the dim concrete garage and the word surrender formed itself behind my eyes. The phone sat in the cup holder. One call to Rhonda. Accept whatever settlement he offered. I could drop the property claim. I could let him keep the house across the street with his pregnant girlfriend. I could just go back to being quiet and small as long as I got to keep my son. That was exactly what Brandon wanted. He wanted to exhaust me until I simply gave up. And it was working perfectly. At 1 o'clock in the morning, the house was silent. I sat on the carpeted floor of Mason's bedroom. My spine pressed hard against the wooden frame of his bed. The room was dark. The plastic turtle on the nightstand projected its slow, rotating pattern of green and blue stars across the ceiling. Mason breathed in a deep, rhythmic cadence. The faint scent of lavender laundry detergent rose from his quilt. The wind rattled the window pane outside. I looked up. The small tin box rested on the top shelf. The embossed dogwood flowers caught a faint glint from the artificial stars. I stood up, reached the top shelf, and pulled the box down. I sat back on the carpet and removed the lid. I had already read the trust document. I had already read the first letter sitting on top. But the night stretched out empty and quiet, and sleep was entirely impossible. I lifted the thick stack of legal papers. I turned page 1. I turned page 2. The thick paper rustled in the quiet room. I turned page 3. Page 4. A small piece of lined notebook paper folded neatly into a tight square sat wedged firmly into the crease between page 4 and page 5. My breath caught in my throat. I pulled the square free. The paper was different from the first letter. The blue ink was much darker. The strokes were shakier. Granny May must have tucked it inside weeks after she wrote the first note, hiding it deep in the legal jargon where only someone turning every single page would ever find it. I unfolded the square. "Jenna, my girl," the blue ink read, "you reading this means you finally needed it. I am sorry I am not sitting right there beside you, but the dirt is there. I want you to look closely at this paper. I did not leave this land to someone's wife. I left it to Jenna, the girl who planted tomatoes with me every Saturday afternoon, the girl who sang off key without an ounce of shame, the girl I am most proud of in this entire world. This land is yours because you are worthy of it, not because you belong to anyone else." My hands lowered to my lap. The paper rested on my knee. 6 years of my life vanished into the quiet dark of the bedroom. I had lived those 6 years entirely as Brandon's wife. I measured my worth by how well I kept his house, how well I raised his son, how smoothly I made his life run. Before that, I was a quiet college student, trying not to take up too much space. Before that, I was a motherless 12-year-old child, keeping out of the way of a new stepmother. I had never just been Jenna. I absorbed the needs of every single person around me to ensure they would never leave me behind. Granny May saw me. She saw me completely long before I ever looked in a mirror and recognized myself. She did not look at me and see a girl who needed a husband to protect her. She saw the girl with dirt under her fingernails, and she left me the ground to stand on. She left me the absolute proof that someone in this world saw my true value. The heavy weight in my chest dissolved. The desperate, panicked drive to hold my marriage together evaporated into the cool air of the bedroom. What Brandon offered was not a family. It was an arrangement. He needed me to be functional furniture. A marriage that required me to be invisible was no marriage at all. The person May Calloway described in that letter was someone worth fighting for. I was Jenna Calloway, and I was the rightful owner of the ground beneath my feet. I folded the small letter and placed it carefully back inside the tin box. I stood up and walked down the hallway. I unlocked the back door and stepped out into the humid night air. I walked off the wooden porch. The cold dirt met the bare soles of my feet. I walked straight to the small rectangular patch by the fence. Crickets chirped in the tall grass. I dropped to my knees in the dirt. I reached out in the darkness, wrapped my bare hands around a thick cluster of weeds, and pulled them out by the roots. I ripped another handful from the earth and then another, clearing the soil with my bare hands under the light of the moon. The earth was cool and dense against my skin. Roots tore free with a satisfying resistance. A palmetto bug skittered across the exposed dirt and disappeared under the fence. I kept pulling. My fingertips scraped against something solid buried in the clay. A small, smooth river stone, the kind Granny May used to line the edges of her beds. I held it in my palm. The moon caught its wet surface. I set it carefully at the corner of the cleared patch and reached for the next clump of weeds. By the time the first gray light crept across the sky, I had cleared the entire rectangular bed. My arms ached from the elbows to the wrists. My knees were caked in mud. I sat back on my heels and looked at the dark open soil. It was just a patch of dirt. But it was my patch of dirt on my land, and no one had given me permission to clear it. I had simply knelt down and started digging. The dirt under my fingernails stayed there for days. By the time week 6 arrived, the frantic, cornered energy that had driven me through the courthouse and the garage and the sleepless night had burned down to something quieter and more solid. I sat in the firm leather chair inside the downtown office of Rhonda Price. The air conditioning hummed a steady low note against the Savannah heat. The room smelled of hot printer toner and bitter black coffee. Rhonda looked at me over the top of her reading glasses while I laid a yellow legal pad on her desk. I had written my thoughts out in blue ink. We were not going to wait for Brandon to build his false narrative in court. We were going to dismantle his foundation piece by piece. First, we needed to fortify the trust. I told Rhonda to contact the bank where Granny May managed her accounts. The bank records would confirm the exact date she established the trust, perfectly matching the results of the forensic examination. The name of the attorney who drafted the original paperwork for May surfaced from somewhere deep in my memory. He was still practicing law right here in the city. I told Rhonda to get him on the phone. He could provide a sworn affidavit confirming my grandmother set up the trust entirely of her own free will. Rhonda nodded slowly, her pen scratching across her own pad. Next was the money. I told her to subpoena the specific real estate agency where Brandon worked. They had to maintain a paper trail for the commission check generated by the sale of Lot 14B. As for the guardian ad litem evaluation, the panic had burned itself out. I told Rhonda to let the evaluator come to my house. I was not going to frantically scrub the baseboards or pretend my life was perfectly intact. I was going to offer a clean, honest home. I would sit at my table and tell the absolute truth. I was going through a divorce. I was a part-time teacher and my son was safe, stable, and deeply loved. I also told her Gloria was ready to testify about the behavioral patterns Brandon mirrored from his father. Punishing my husband held no appeal. The goal was simpler and harder than revenge. Protect my son. Protect the land my grandmother entrusted to me. Protect the person May saw when she looked at a little girl with dirt under her fingernails. Rhonda closed her file folder and folded her hands. She told me the plan was solid. The tight knot resting at the base of my neck loosened for the first time in 6 years. The guardian ad litem arrived the following Tuesday at 10 in the morning. She was a tall woman in a gray linen blazer with a clipboard pressed against her hip. I opened the front door and let her inside. Mason sat at the kitchen table eating sliced apples and peanut butter. The house was clean but not staged. The dishes were done. A basket of unfolded laundry sat on the couch because laundry was always sitting on the couch. I did not hide it. She walked through every room. She opened the refrigerator. She looked at the backyard through the kitchen window and paused at the freshly cleared garden bed near the fence. In Mason's bedroom, she crouched down to his level and asked him about his favorite book. He told her about the caterpillar. He told her Granny May used to tap the page when the bug ate the strawberry. She wrote something on her clipboard. She asked him if he was happy living here. He said yes, and then he asked her if she wanted to see the spot where his mommy was going to plant tomatoes. She followed him outside. I stood on the porch with my arms folded and let my son speak for himself. When the evaluator left 45 minutes later, she shook my hand at the front door and told me she had everything she needed. The forensic report on the trust document arrived the following week. Authentic. Every signature, every date, every notarization confirmed. Rhonda called me on a Friday afternoon and told me Brandon's attorney had requested a settlement conference. His exact words, she said, were that his client was eager to resolve the matter before the situation caused further damage to his professional reputation. The settlement conference took place during week 8, inside the private chambers of the judge. The room felt incredibly small and close. A heavy cherry wood table occupied most of the available space. The air carried the dry, dusty scent of heavy law books lining the wooden shelves. Through the single tall window, I could see the sprawling branches of a massive oak tree, its thick roots pushing violently up through the concrete sidewalk outside. I wore a navy blue blazer I had purchased for myself 2 days prior. It fit my shoulders perfectly. I sat next to Rhonda. Brandon sat across from me, next to his expensive attorney. Brandon wore a brand new charcoal suit. He looked comfortable. He looked confident. His attorney cleared his throat and proposed what he called a generous offer. He suggested 50-50 physical custody. I would retain the marital home. Brandon would keep his investment property across the street. We would divide the remaining joint assets straight down the middle. Brandon leaned back in his leather chair and flashed a brief reassuring smile in my direction. Rhonda did not return the smile. She opened her thick file. She announced that the forensic examination results had arrived that very morning. The trust document was entirely authentic. The creation date placed its origin 3 years before my grandmother passed away. Bank records corroborated the exact timeline. The original drafting attorney had submitted a full sworn affidavit confirming his involvement. The trust was legally binding and entirely valid under state law. Lot 14A and Lot 14B belonged exclusively to me. Therefore, the sale of Lot 14B by the estate administrator was completely void. The developer possessed a defective deed. Brandon's smile vanished instantly. His jaw went completely rigid. His attorney sat up straight and requested a sidebar, but Rhonda was not finished. She slid a thick stack of subpoenaed documents across the cherrywood table. She detailed the internal records retrieved from Brandon's agency. He had received a $15,800 commission check for facilitating the sale of my land 18 months ago. He knew the land was sitting there, he personally profited from the sale, and he willfully concealed the money from his wife. Rhonda then produced a copy of the lease agreement between Brandon and Cassidy for the new house across the street. The listed rent was $1 a month. Rhonda stated the final math out loud for the court reporter. Between the down payment, the closing costs, and the concealed commission, Brandon had redirected over $70,000 of marital funds to his mistress. His attorney immediately requested a recess. I walked out into the courthouse hallway to get a drink of water from the fountain. Brandon paced rapidly near the elevators. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his leather keychain. He spun the keys on his index finger. It was his old power tactic, the exact same motion he used in our kitchen when he told me to serve his mistress or leave my home. But this time his hand trembled. The keys slipped from his finger and crashed heavily onto the hard terrazzo floor. The metallic clatter echoed sharply down the quiet corridor. He crouched down to retrieve them. His suit jacket bunched at the shoulders. The polished leather of his shoe squeaked against the terrazzo. When he stood back up, his eyes met mine. The perfect, charming mask was gone. The confidence he wore like cologne had evaporated. His lower lip pressed hard against his teeth. He looked completely terrified. He took a step toward me. "Jenna, listen to me," he started, his voice cracking. "Your lawyer is twisting things. You do not understand the whole picture here." I looked at his shaking hands. I looked at the tailored suit that could no longer hide his panic. "Your lawyer is waiting for you, Brandon. You are making a huge mistake." I read the deed, I told him, keeping my voice perfectly level. I read all of it. That is the whole picture. I turned my back on him and walked straight back into chambers. Rhonda was rearranging her papers calmly. She did not look up. I sat in my chair and placed my hands flat on the cold cherry wood table, exactly the way Brandon used to place his hands when he lectured me in our kitchen. The posture came naturally now. My palms pressed against the polished surface, and the tremor in my fingers stilled. Through the tall window, the massive oak tree stood perfectly motionless in the thick afternoon air. Its roots had cracked the concrete wide open to make room for themselves. Nobody poured the sidewalk back over the roots. The concrete simply learned to accommodate the tree. 10 minutes later, his attorney returned. The man's expression carried the particular tightness of someone delivering news his client never expected to hear. Brandon walked in behind him and sat down without making eye contact with me. His attorney placed a single typed page in the center of the table, a completely revised settlement. Brandon conceded all property claims immediately. He accepted a highly unfavorable division of the remaining assets to account for the stolen funds. He withdrew his allegations of parental alienation entirely and dropped the custody fight, giving me primary physical custody. In exchange, I agreed not to pursue formal fraud charges regarding the unauthorized land sale, because I had proven his adultery with a pregnant mistress, State law explicitly barred him from seeking any alimony from my future teaching salary. The ink dried on the thick paper. The battle was over. A few weeks later, the warm May sunshine baked the savannah morning air. A humid breeze blew in from the island, carrying the soft scent of salt and sweet blooming jasmine. I stood in my backyard garden. The dark soil smelled wet and rich from the morning watering. Mason laughed loudly as the green plastic watering can slipped from his hands, splashing cool water over his small sneakers. He bent down to inspect the bright green leaves of 3 small tomato plants we had put in the ground the previous weekend. I stood tall and looked out over the low wooden fence. I stood exactly halfway between the 2 structures. The house on my left held my son, my life, and my history. The house on my right stood entirely empty. A large wooden for sale sign sat crookedly on the front lawn. Cassidy had packed her bags and moved back to Atlanta the moment Brandon lost the ability to fund her comfortable lifestyle. The developer was actively suing Brandon in civil court over the voided title. Brandon was currently renting a tiny studio apartment on the other side of town, facing a severe internal review from his real estate agency. I looked down at my left hand. I did not rub my thumb over my ring finger. My hand was bare. A faint, pale indentation remained on the skin, but it was fading a little more every single day. Mason tugged on the hem of my jeans. "Mommy, are the tomatoes big yet?" I crouched down next to him and touched a delicate green leaf. "Not yet, baby. It will take a few more months." "That is too long." "The dirt needs time to do its work," I told him gently. My grandmother knew this land had sustained our family for 4 generations. I was the 5th. Mason was the 6th. Men like Richard and Brandon always left when things grew difficult, but the ground remained solid under our feet every single morning. I looked back toward the house. Gloria sat on the shaded wooden porch. A glass of iced sweet tea rested on the small table beside her. She watched me and Mason in the garden. She smiled, picked up her glass, took a slow sip, and then stood up. She walked down the wooden steps and crossed the grass. She did not say a word. She simply picked up a small metal hand trowel resting by the fence, knelt in the dirt beside us, and began to carefully loosen the soil around the second plant. Mason leaned over and patted the dirt down around the roots with his small, flat palm. Gloria reached over and gently adjusted his technique, guiding his hand in a slow circle. "Press soft," she told him. "The roots need room to breathe." He nodded seriously the way 4-year-olds nod when they believe they have been given an important job. 3 generations knelt together in the warm morning sun. I looked down at my hands. Dark, rich dirt was packed tight beneath my fingernails. The image of a little girl sitting in this exact same spot with Granny May rose up through the warm soil. That girl planted tomato seeds without any understanding of heartbreak or betrayal. She sat on her inheritance for years without recognizing it. The woman kneeling here now held the deed in her name and the dirt in her hands.